He did not speak at the wedding. He did not speak in the carriage that carried them up through the wet green fold of the hills to Underhollow, nor at the cold supper laid for two in a hall built to seat 40, and when his bride paused at the foot of the great stairs and said, in a voice with not one tremor in it, "Good night, your grace," Caspar only bowed, because every word he owned stood crowded and burning behind his teeth, and he had sworn on his brother's grave that he would never spend a single one of them upon the woman who ought to have been his brother's wife. Her name was Nerissa. He had known it for 5 years without once saying it aloud. He had heard Aubrey say it 100 times instead, at dinner, in the stable yard, over cards, over nothing at all, saying it the way a man says the name of a country he means to live in forever. Now Aubrey lay beneath a flat grey stone in the chapel at the bottom of the park, and Nerissa Ardley was Duchess of Underhollow, and Caspar had discovered that there was exactly one mercy left in the world, and it was silence. The house agreed with him. Underhollow sat in a fold of the hills, as its name promised, and the slopes leaned so close over the roofs that the sun came late and went early, and the stone never entirely dried. The mirrors had been under Holland covers since the funeral. The music room at the end of the west corridor had been locked since a week before it, and the key hung on Caspar's own ring, and no one in 7 months had asked him for it. In the mornings he came down at 8 and found her already at the table, straight-backed in half-mourning grey, and he inclined his head, and she inclined hers, and the footman poured. She would say something to the room. The east chimney was smoking again. The Widow Marl's roof had gone in the gale. The bridge at the ford wanted a rail. And Caspar would turn to his housekeeper and say, "Mrs. Pell, see to the east chimney," or, "Mrs. Pell, send Baxter to the Widow Marl," in a perfectly clear and civil voice, and Mrs. Pell would say, "Yes, your grace," and the Duchess of Underhollow would butter her bread and say nothing more. He knew what it looked like. He was not a stupid man, and he did not tell himself lies about it. He simply believed, with the whole grim strength of a man who has decided a thing once and never revisited it, that the debt required this. Aubrey had been going to marry her. Aubrey had been going to fill this house with her voice, and Caspar would have stood at the wedding as a brother and been glad, and instead he had stood at a graveside in November rain and then, 11 weeks later, at an altar, taking his brother's place in front of a clergyman who could not meet his eye. She did not become smaller under it, which he had not expected. She took the household in hand within a fortnight. She learned every tenant's name and every tenant's trouble. She had the still room scoured and the linen mended and the lamps in the long gallery lit at 4 o'clock in the winter dark, so that a man coming in from the stables walked into warmth instead of a tomb. Caspar watched all of it from windows and doorways and the far end of tables, and said nothing, and drank the silence like a man drinking something he knew was poisoning him and could not set down. "She asked me today whether you take sugar," Mrs. Pell said one evening, setting down his brandy with rather more force than the glass required. "Her Grace, 7 months in this house, and she has to ask the housekeeper whether her husband takes sugar in his tea." Caspar looked at the fire. "I have served this family since your mother's time," Mrs. Pell went on quite steadily, "so I shall say it once and then hold my tongue. Grief is a heavy thing, and you have carried it like a gentleman. But that girl upstairs has lost more than you know and less than she deserves, and there is not a soul under this roof who can tell her why the Duke of Underhollow speaks to the dogs and not to his wife." She curtsied. "Good night, your grace." He had sent him. That was the whole of it, and he had never said it aloud to any living creature. There had been a quarrel, a small, ugly, entirely forgettable quarrel about money and a horse. At the end of it Caspar had thrown down the letters that had to reach the attorney at Lyddon by morning and said, coldly, being the elder and being the Duke, that Aubrey might for once make himself useful and carry them. And Aubrey, who never sulked for longer than 10 minutes together, had grinned and said he would be back for breakfast, and had ridden down to a ford that the rain of 3 days had turned into something no horse should have been asked to cross. They found his hat first. They found the rest of him a mile downstream, in the grey light, and Caspar had carried his brother up the bank himself, and had not permitted anyone else to touch him. The marriage was not his doing. Old Ardley had died in the spring owing more than his land was worth. And the settlement drawn up for Aubrey had been signed and sealed and lodged, and there was no clean way out of it that did not end with Nerissa Ardley in a strange town on £40 a year, and her name pitied at every tea table in the county. Caspar's own attorney had put it to him plainly. Caspar had said, "Then draw it up," and had signed where he was told, and had not once looked at the woman standing beside him in the church. Winter came down hard. She stopped saying things to the room. She still came down at 8, and still inclined her head, and still ran his house better than it had been run in 30 years. But the small offerings, the chimney, the roof, the rail at the ford, dried up one by one, and Caspar found he missed them the way a man misses a sound he never knew he had been listening for. Then, on a black afternoon in February, she caught him in the gallery. She stood squarely in the middle of the carpet, so that he could not pass without walking around her, and she looked up at him with her chin level and her hands quite still. "Your Grace," she said, "I have gone over it 100 times, and I cannot find it, so I am going to ask, have I done something?" The words were there, all of them, that it was not her doing, and never had been, that he could not look at her without hearing his brother laughing at that same table, that he himself was the reason his brother was dead. They came up in him with such violence that his jaw ached with holding them. Caspar bowed and stepped around her and walked on. He heard her breathe out behind him, one small, wrecked sound, quickly mastered. Then her steps went the other way, unhurried, perfectly dignified, all the way to the end of the gallery, and a door closed, and Underhollow was as quiet as it had been for 7 months. It was 3 nights later that he heard her singing. He had not slept well since the gallery. He had taken to walking the house at unreasonable hours with a single candle, and it was somewhere past 1 when he came along the west corridor and stopped as though a hand had been laid flat on his chest. There was a thread of sound coming from under the door of the music room. A woman's voice, low, unhurried, singing. The door was unlocked. He had left the key in it himself a week ago, one of those small cowardly gestures a man makes instead of speaking, and she had evidently found it and told nobody. Caspar set his candle on the floor and looked through the 2 inches of open door. She had taken the Holland cover off the pianoforte and folded it over a chair. One candle stood on the closed lid, and Nerissa sat before it with her hands resting on the wood, not playing, because the instrument had not been tuned since his mother died and every note in it had gone sour, only resting her hands there as though the thing were an old friend who could no longer talk. She was singing a plain country song about a girl walking out in the morning to see what the weather would do. It was not sad, it was not a lament, it was the sort of thing a woman sings to herself when there is no one in the house to sing to. That was what undid him. He had prepared himself over 7 months for her tears, her temper, her reproaches. He had made no preparation at all for the discovery that his wife sat alone at midnight in a locked room, singing to a broken pianoforte simply to have something in the world answer her back. He had thought he was serving a debt. He had been holding a living woman under water night after night and calling it penance. Her voice went thin on the last line and stopped. She did not weep. She sat with her hands on the lid and her shoulders very straight, and after a moment she said quietly to nobody, "Well, that will do." Caspar pushed the door open. She was on her feet at once, her hand at the candle, her face composed to the careful nothing she wore at breakfast. "Your Grace, forgive me. I found the key, and I should not have. Nerissa." He heard the name leave him. He had not said it in 5 years. It came out low and cracked and altogether unlike his own voice, and it went through the room like a stone through ice. She did not move. She stood with the candle throwing its small light up under her chin, and he watched her understand, in the space of 3 heartbeats, that he had spoken, and then her mouth trembled once and she put out a hand and set it on the back of the chair. "I sent him," Caspar said. "Your Grace. We quarrelled over a horse. He had not planned a word of it, and it came out of him whole the way water comes through a rail that has finally gone. There were papers that had to reach Liddon. I could have gone myself. I was angry, and I was the elder, and I told him to make himself useful, and he laughed and said he would be back for breakfast, and I let him ride down to that ford in the dark. I carried him up the bank. I have not been able to say his name since, and I could not say yours, because you were his, and every time I looked at you across that table I heard him saying it." He stopped. His hands were shaking. He was distantly amazed by it. I told myself my silence was owed to him. It was cowardice, and you have paid for every day of it. I do not ask you to forgive it. I only could not let you sit in the dark another night believing the fault was yours. The candle guttered. Nerissa sat down on the pianoforte with great care, as though it were the only task she could presently manage, and when she looked up her eyes were bright and steady. I loved him, she said. I want to say it plainly, because I think you have been afraid of it. I loved him the way a girl of 19 loves a bright, kind boy who makes her laugh, and I grieve him, and I shall grieve him always. She drew a breath. And I have spent 7 months in this house believing that the man I married hated me for being alive when his brother was not. Do you know what that is like, Caspar? To be hated in silence and to have no charge to answer. It was the first time she had used his name. He found he could not speak at all now, having spent everything. The river killed him, she said. Not you. I have known the whole of that story since November. The Ford, the papers, the quarrel. Your steward's wife told mine, and she told me, and I have carried it about with me all winter, waiting for you to give me leave to say that I do not blame you and never have. Her voice broke at last, only a little. I did not marry a grave. I do not believe you did either. Caspar crossed the room. He did not touch her. He was not certain he had the right. He put his hand on the pianoforte beside hers, close enough to feel the coming off her fingers, and said, "Wait here." He came back with a drawer. He set it on the closed lid between them, an old shallow drawer out of the writing desk in his own room, and in it were letters. Dozens of them, folded, sealed, addressed in his own hand to Her Grace the Duchess of Underhollow, and every one unsent. 1 a week, he said, since the wedding. Some are about the tenants. 1 is about the east chimney. 3 of them are apologies, and 1, I am ashamed to say, is 4 pages upon the subject of your handwriting. He could not look at her. I could not say a word to you. It seems I could not stop writing them.